Hello, welcome all. I am pleased to welcome you all to this discussion on the state of race in clinical equations hosted by the Doris Duke Foundation. My name is Kevin Sia, the Program Officer for Medical Research at the Doris Duke Foundation, which supports, the foundation supports the well-being of people and the planet for a more equitable, creative, and sustainable future. It operates 5 national grant-making programs in the performing arts, the environment, medical research, child and family well-being, and mutual understanding between communities, as well as Duke Farms and Shangri-La, 2 centers that serve the public directly. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items for this hour-long session. We'll be having a moderated conversation, at the end of which will be a question and answer session with questions submitted by you. Don't wait to submit your questions all at the end, though. We encourage you to submit your questions throughout the conversation by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you see a question someone else has asked and you're interested in hearing the answer to, you may click the thumbs up icon underneath that question. So there's a lot to discuss. We'll try to get to all the questions, but we may not get to them all. So we encourage you to send unaddressed comments and questions to Dr. Sindy Escobar Alvarez, Program Director for Medical Research here at the Doris Duke Foundation, and I'll drop the email in the chat. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for this exciting discussion, Ryan Levi. Ryan is a reporter and producer for the national nonprofit health policy news organization, Tradeoffs. Since starting at Tradeoffs in 2019, Ryan has reported on a wide range of topics, including this past summer, a fantastic two-part report, Rooting Out Racial Bias in Healthcare AI, about the challenges of keeping racial bias out of clinical artificial intelligence, and new federal regulations looking to address this issue. Before 2019, Ryan spent 3 years as a reporter and podcast producer at KQED, the NPR member station in the San Francisco Bay Area. And his work has been featured on NPR, Slate, PBS NewsHour, Marketplace, and Here and Now. So with that, I'll turn it over and welcome Ryan.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And so excited to be here with all of you for this really important and timely conversation about clinical algorithms and the role of race in them. We have an incredible panel of folks here who have such a deep breadth of knowledge on this issue, and I'm really excited for the conversation we're about to have. Before we get started, I'm just going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves, and then we will dive in. Sindy, do you want to go first?
I'm happy to, and thanks for hosting this discussion and for moderating the discussion, Ryan. So I am Sindy Escobar Alvarez, Doris Duke Foundation's Director for Medical Research, and I am a biochemist who has been working in philanthropy for the last decade to strengthen clinical research. And this has led me to now to tackle questions about how scientific practice can be strengthened to promote equity in who benefits from the products of clinical research.
Helen, you want to go next?
Delighted. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Dr. Helen Burstin. I'm a general internist and a health services researcher, and I lead an organization called the Council of Medical Specialty Societies, a coalition of more than 50 medical specialties across medicine that work collaboratively to improve care and particularly improve equity. And we're really delighted to partner with Doris Duke and Sindy to produce this report. And we're delighted, of course, to have one of our members, AP, join us today with Dr. Wright.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for having us on this panel this morning. It's a pleasure to be back with Drs. Burstin and Escobar Alvarez, and my name is Joseph Wright. I am a pediatric emergency physician and currently serve as the Chief Health Equity Officer for the American Academy of Pediatrics. And our organization is one of the grantees of the Doris Duke Foundation to take on this work, and I'll be talking about our project, which is focused on establishing a race-conscious approach to improving pediatric practice. So again, delighted to be with you all this morning.
Thank you all so much. And as many of you know, or hopefully know, this conversation kind of comes out of first a convening and then a report that the Doris Duke Foundation, Helen's organization, and several others came together to dig into this issue of race in clinical algorithms. It is a fascinating report with lots of really great recommendations. We are going to dig into many of them here today, but not nearly all of them. So I highly recommend that after this conversation, you go ahead and read that full report. It's going to have a lot of really helpful information for folks as you're thinking about this really important and difficult issue. To kick things off, I want to start with Joseph with asking you to give us just kind of a very basic definition of what is a clinical algorithm. We're talking about race and clinical algorithms. It would be helpful to know what we're talking about.
Certainly, Ryan, and let me just add a couple of terms here because they all fit into what I call decision support tools. So clinical algorithms, clinical equations, clinical practice guidelines, they are all designed to help the process of making clinical decisions by practitioners and are based on best evidence and best practice and are used in the care of patients, simply put. And so these these decision support tools are all designed to facilitate the way that we take care of patients.
And these, obviously I came to this conversation really from as Kevin mentioned, from kind of the artificial intelligence world. And so we've been hearing a lot of conversations recently as AI has come to dominate conversations about algorithms. And I think there are a lot of folks that often equate algorithm automatically with AI, but these are not necessarily AI algorithms that we're talking about. These are algorithms that have been around for a long time before we were talking about artificial intelligence, right? Joseph, can you give us just a little bit of the history of these algorithms and specifically the role of race in them? What is the role and why is race a factor in these algorithms?
Well, let me just double down on something that you made very clear in your remarks, Ryan. These are not algorithms or guidelines or equations that are rooted in artificial intelligence. It's not what we're talking about. And to your point about understanding how we got here, which is a question that I'm asked most often by patients and members of the public, I think it's probably best to give a couple of examples that perhaps folks participating in the webinar today may have experienced. So if anyone has used a spirometer to check their lung function, blown into a spirometer, and that procedure is actually race normed. In other words, the whole process of producing what we call pulmonary function tests to assess the adequacy of somebody's lung function goes back, the history of it goes back several hundred years, where rooted in, frankly, unsubstantiated and racialized science, there was hypothesized that there were lung capacity differences between the enslaved and the enslavers. And that premise has lived on through several hundred years to really support the premise that we ought to be assessing lung function based on someone's socially determined race. And that's a very rather clear example, something that many people have experienced, but probably are unaware that the very function or the procedure of producing pulmonary function tests are rooted in that kind of history. Another example that's received a lot of attention, Ryan, and I'm sure has been part of your reporting, is the way that we stage chronic kidney disease. And that is rooted into, again, an unsubstantiated yet widely practiced premise that there were differences in skeletal muscle mass between people who, again, were race assigned as Black and others. So therefore, without getting too technical about it, a specific test that we use to assess kidney function, serum creatinine, was scored differently for Black patients than white patients, and resulting in Black patients being frankly ratcheted in a different place when we talk about the degree to which their chronic kidney disease either was referred for advanced care or even transplantation. And that's an example, again, rooted in historical science that is, again, not substantiated and has resulted in race-based outcomes for that particular condition. So those are just two examples of where, again, science that is either wrong or frankly rooted in bias from the very beginning has found its way into practices that we use today.
And Joseph, you can answer this, or anyone else on the panel, do we have a sense of how common this is? Those are two really helpful examples to help us get our heads around what it looks like to have race included in a clinical algorithm, but how common is it that these types of clinical supports that you're talking about include race as a factor?
It's more common than I think any of us expected. I think when this really sort of became more of a discussion item about 3 years ago or so with an article in the New England Journal of Medicine that really highlighted about a dozen algorithms, I think most clinicians, physicians, medical students were really surprised to see how pervasive it is. I think the work Joseph is doing is sort of uncovering, wow, it's even more pervasive than I think we thought. And I think what's really interesting is that I think this is a great opportunity for us to really use this as a teaching case with our medical students, our residents, our practicing physicians as well, for them to understand how pervasive and deep some of these inequities go and how these historical biases have really been baked in to our clinical guidelines and the algorithms. And an important point that Joseph made as well, the algorithms are really just the tip of the iceberg here. The algorithms are where we've baked in a set cut point. But there are many more guidelines where we make recommendations, but don't necessarily say, at this point, do X, or at this point, do Y, that also include race. So there's really a significant piece here where we need to go back and just question. I was actually mentioning on our prep call, for example, sitting with one of my residents a couple weeks ago saying, looking at an echocardiogram report going, do we have any idea why race is included in an echocardiogram? There's no reason we could think of it. I think this is a great example of where I think we can just teach those coming up with us, those we're, really honored to teach, to question this in a way that I think Joseph and I, coming up through our training, it wasn't even apparent. It was not transparent. And I think this is a great learning opportunity.
And Ryan, if I just might amplify something that Helen said, and I'll turn it over to Sindy. What we're learning through the project that Sindy and the Doris Duke Foundation is supporting for the American Academy of Pediatrics is that when you actually have race, and what I didn't say that I want to make sure is very clear, race is a social construct and should never be substituted as a biologic construct alone. And this is what we're talking about here. So when we look at a clinical algorithm where race or ethnicity actually appears, you look at the algorithm and you get to a decision point, a cut point, where it actually identifies the patient's race, so racial identification. Those are easy to see. And as Helen said, that's the tip of the iceberg. What is much more problematic is when bias is insidiously woven into the creation or the establishment of clinical practice guidelines. And in our work through the Doris Duke Foundation, with the support of Doris Duke Foundation, we're finding that is really going to be the heavy lift to really get at the algorithms that have been frankly rooted in bias, where the words may not appear on an actual algorithm itself.
Exactly. And, just from a perspective of research, I think something that we acknowledge is that, to your point, that not the way in which race is considered in research is not always apparent, right? Like a tool is produced, an algorithm is produced that ultimately will have an output that in the back end has considered race in a way that may ascribe a biological meaning to it, perhaps, and that's probably the worst case scenario. And in some cases, it may not make a difference, but the way in which race is considered at the research step, when those tools are being developed, is what can be very invisible. Like we really have to look for those. And there is some work that was covered both in the report as well as in the meeting by Dr. Shazi Siddiqui at UPenn, who has looked at a range of algorithms and how does race show up in those. And it is, researchers encounter race as a variable and they use it, right? And they use it as a variable, whether it's merited or not. So there, to your question, it appears more often than we'd like it not to, unquestioned, right? Or it needs more questioning.
I know we're gonna get into kind of the insidiousness and the difficultness of kind of rooting this stuff out later on in the conversation. One last question I want to ask on kind of the history and kind of before we get into a little bit of where we are now in the report itself is both the examples that you mentioned, Joseph, are ones where it sounds like kind of the race consideration is this person, as you say, kind of race coded as Black or as not Black? And I'm curious, I know this is something that comes up a lot in, Sindy, to your point, in research and in lots of work in healthcare of, as the construct of race is very varied and includes lots of different population groups. And so I'm curious, to the extent that we know, are most of the algorithms that we're talking about here looking at things in terms of, is this person Black or are they not Black, or are they looking at other definitions of race or ethnicity as well?
So, Ryan, I think you've hit the point that the way that race is used in many of these algorithms is binary. It's like Black or white. We know that the admixture, if you will, of genetics, of ancestry, of race assignment is much more complex than that. And makes it even more troubling when you consider that race assignment, someone may look at you and make an assumption and have that weigh in to a clinical decision. It can be arbitrary. And so, yes, you're absolutely right that, and you mentioned ethnicity. One of the historical examples that I did not mention that does include ethnicity is a algorithm that assess the likelihood of a woman to be able to deliver vaginally after having had a cesarean section. And that algorithm includes ethnicity as well, Hispanic or non-Hispanic, as a decision point. So again, without getting into the sordid history of that particular one, again, attempts to make assessments that do not wash in terms of the science. And all the more reason why the research community that Sindy is representing on the current panel that the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine has seated is very thoughtfully. Again, this is something that for a pediatrician is hard to say, but not throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's important to assess the impact of racial identification on one's lived experience, for instance, and how that may have influence with regard to health status or health outcomes. So you can't ignore it. You can't ignore it. And I think your question, Ryan, points out how complex the consideration of race is in these algorithms.
And I'll just add briefly, I think one of the recommendations in the report, for example, is to have diverse enough data sets for research and for our guidelines, as a matter of fact, to be able to make recommendations that are in fact more precise, both in terms of being able to get beyond using race as a proxy, biological proxy, which it shouldn't be used as, but actually having the data that appropriately looks at what might be the social and environmental factors that might be leading to some of those differences, whether those are social determinants of health, whether that's structural racism, or whether that's more of that precise ancestry or background that may in fact be increasing risk. We know, for example, strong evidence of certain Asian communities have higher risk of liver cancer. If we just sort of lump communities together, we miss where there may be increased risk, where we could be in fact doing something to target and alleviate risk.
Excellent. And I know we're going to come back to you're all doing a great job of seeding some of these ideas that we're going to talk
Can't help
about down
ourselves.
the
Sorry,
road.
Ryan.
No, this is perfect.
No,
This is
sorry.
perfect. And there's so much important stuff to talk about here. This is great. And I really appreciate all of y'all for kind of helping give us that historical context. When we were on the prep call for this, Joseph made it very clear, like, we need to talk about the history of how we got here before we can really dig into where we're going to go next. And so I really appreciate that. And I think that has been super helpful. I want to move now to kind of the report and a little bit of where we are now. And so, Sindy, I want to turn to you and ask you to give us just a little bit of context on kind of the current state of the field and why the Doris Duke Foundation, along with its partners, brought together this group and this convening in this report to talk about race in clinical algorithms. What were y'all seeing, and why was this something that you felt needed to get a closer look?
Yeah, happy to speak to that. So, the meeting really came about because at Doris Duke, we saw that addressing consideration of race in algorithm design is a priority if we as a clinical research community want to actively contribute to health equity. And we also realized that this is not the work of just one organization, right? And so we were really thrilled to find partners in CMSS, the Council of Medical Specialty Societies, and the Moore Foundation, and to be hosted by the National Academy of Medicine. Helen and her team, as well as Tommy Wang, Daniel Yang at the Moore Foundation, are some of the most collaborative people I encountered. And I think they saw that this is also important and had been working in other realms like AI, right? And so through this meeting, we saw an opportunity to lift examples for why it matters. Why do we need to care about this issue, right? Then when we hear a lot about AI, as you pointed out earlier, there are these legacy algorithms. Why do we need to care, right? And to showcase ongoing efforts that demonstrate that considerations of race in the design of algorithms has real impacts beyond the publication, by a group of researchers, and that not testing how implementation may contribute to inequities or removing these algorithms for the health system can be very difficult once they're in place. So we saw that there was opportunity to lift all of those ideas and really from the work of people who are looking at these questions, and to begin to bring together what is a community that wants to form, right? There are people who are working in different parts of the problem, but at the core of it, we thought that there are some cross-cutting issues across medical specialties that could come together and begin to see that there's a common thread and perhaps some common ways to work in their own rounds for each organization to address the issue from different angles, and to see the spectrum of the actions that are needed to really move forward. So that's what I would say. So we came out of these with a sense that there's ongoing work at all aspects, from algorithm design all the way to implementation. There are people who are thinking about regulation and what kinds of gatekeepers you need to get involved so that the whole, from design to implementation of algorithms, promotes health equity.
I want to pick up on something you mentioned, kind of the AI, and obviously it's been coming up a lot already in this conversation. And this was a question that I asked Sindy when we first talked about this, and I would love to hear your answer as well as Helen and Joseph. But I think honestly, one of my initial instincts when I started looking into this and looking at this was AI is what everyone's talking about right now. That's where we need to be focusing and really thinking about. Why do these non-AI algorithms, why do we need to be looking at those? And I think that so I really actually love to hear from each of you on kind of why it is important that we're looking at these, as we've called them, legacy algorithms, these non-AI algorithms, given that there's so much attention happening right now around AI.
Absolutely, and I think they both complement, both complement each other, right? A reason from our perspective of why it matters is that these tools are actually being used by clinicians, by clinical practitioners, and it is largely unstudied what the impact of these equations is on actual health outcomes and driving or contributing to health disparities or not. And that's not a reason not to leave them and forget that they're there, right? I think that just points to the opportunity to, well, we think that in some cases, the way in which race is considered doesn't really seem scientific. And so why don't we just ask the research question? And in doing that, maybe we'll find that AI has a potential answer. Maybe there are, all these tools are created with the best available tools of their time, right? And the thinking of their time. But now that we're evolving, maybe some of that new knowledge, and actually the AI community has been so thoughtful in thinking about the ethical implications that there's probably, and there's not probably, there are lessons there probably that can be applied to some of these legacy algorithms that are being that are already deployed.
And if I could give perhaps one really live example, active example of just what Sindy is talking about, the algorithm that has gotten the most attention in my field in pediatrics, and particularly pediatric emergency medicine, has to do with an algorithm to assess the risk for urinary tract infection in young children. So you show up, and again, I like to put these in the context of very tangible examples. So you show up to an emergency department with your young child under the age of 2 with a high fever. And one of the considerations is what's the source of this fever? Could this child have a urinary tract infection? Well, heretofore, there has been an algorithm supported by a clinical decision support tool that any of our learners, and I'm so glad that Helen emphasized early on the impact of learners, could pull up on their device, and it would guide them to what the care should be. And in the algorithm, you come to a point where it asks if the child is black or white, particularly girls, and it takes you down a different path based on that assessment of race. And to make a long story short, the decision point was whether to obtain a catheterized urine specimen to assess if there is in fact an infection going on. Well, if I could, and I know the investigators who produced this work, and I know that they didn't wake up one day to say they were going to discriminate against little black girls by not offering a catheterized urine specimen when they show up to the emergency department with a fever. However, what was missing is what Sindy is talking about, the careful consideration of the clinical components that need to go into that logistic regression model that are not predicated on a social construct of race. And so race was substituted in as a biologic proxy in this case. And the reason I'm giving you this example, because just this week, in fact, the developers of the calculator that had race as a parameter, a variable, demonstrated that in removing race and substituting it with 2 clinical variables, the presence of fever or history of a prior urinary tract infection, resulted in an equivalently effective algorithm. And so here's a demonstration where the scientists went back and looked at their own data. In fact, they published a meta-analysis, which is looking at the data from all over the world, with the removal of race as an independent variable, and substituted it with clinical variables, and demonstrated through that discovery that it is a clinically effective tool. And that was just published, in fact, actually is last week. in the Journal of Pediatrics, where they looked at the two algorithms, one with race, one without race, and demonstrated that they were virtually similar in efficacy. So this is exactly what Sindy's talking about, to have the scientific community actually apply a deeper dive into and not pulling up short with what might race be a proxy for, and having these clinical variables that were added in was the hard work that needs to be done writ large by the scientific community to get to those answers. So I just give you that as a real life example. Now what Sindy also said, and this is where it's important to remember, it's not about intent, but impact. Not about intent, but impact. No one is trying to call the scientific community racist. But if you can't answer the question in this example, that we are not potentially producing a cohort of little Black girls who grow up with scarred urinary tracts from not having been offered the same equivalent care, then we have to offer equitable care to all little kids. So that's just one example. I think I like to use it because it's a clean example of what can be done, and exactly what Sindy was talking about, the contribution to the scientific community and how important it is.
And Ryan, if I could just add, I think one of the things that was remarkable about our conference and the way that we organized it was the fact that we brought together the clinical community, especially scientific community, the research community, and the tech community. We had a lot of folks from the AI community there. And in fact, our recommendations were all built around this model of the life cycle approach of an algorithm. And in fact, what Joseph just laid out was really the life cycle approach for an algorithm, whether it's an AI algorithm or one that emerged from a clinical guideline, as he just described, the UTI guideline becoming an algorithm. The idea that we need principles for the field, we have to evaluate the research and the methods and the data, we have to identify and then implement a series of approaches, disseminate the best path forward, monitor for algorithmic bias, and then rapidly adapt to a new approach. And as you know, Joseph's now putting out a new algorithm will be out in that space. We then have to be out there and make sure that that clinical community doesn't keep using that old algorithm, which may still be found somewhere out there, right? This has become a really important issue. For example, in the EGFR example that Joseph raised earlier, there may be some places where you could still find the old EGFR that's in place, even though some labs have been putting it forward. So this idea that we all have to be hyper vigilant about making sure we educate folks, it's out there, updated, continuously monitoring for bias of all these algorithms, whether the ones emerging from AI or the ones emerging from clinical guidelines, the approach is the same, and no one community can do it alone. We've got to do it across the research community, the clinical community, as well as the tech community. And that's what I think is great about what we put together in this report.
And Ryan, if I could dovetail off of one word that Sindy used a moment ago, gatekeepers. So for instance, I guarantee you that the work around urinary tract infection risk assessment will never, going forward, include, I'm talking about the publications that are submitted to our medical journals, and the folks who are the editors and the folks who review these studies will be very cognizant of the fact that substituting race as a biologic proxy is wrong. So now we can move forward, at least with that particular slice of science, and think about the utility, for instance, of AI. Can we make that calculator more robust, even more accurate? Now that we recognize that we can perform the risk assessment without the use of race as a proxy, as a biologic proxy. So once we do that cleanup, then we can potentially move forward with using other more robust big data mechanisms to even make our algorithms more accurate.
Yeah, Ryan, and to go back also to the question of where we are in the field, and I think this is some discussion this reminded me of a point that when we started, we thought there's the case of race norming, as Joseph described, right? That we are making associations to race that are not necessarily rooted in biological differences. That's what happens essentially in race norming, but that there are other examples where race is considered to account for inequities in health. So it's just how you use the information, right, matters. And it's not a simple question of we have 10 algorithms and do we remove or do we incorporate race in all of them? It's not a simple question. It's something that was unpacked at the meeting, that there are certainly valid reasons for how it's accounted for. How is the rigor of their work behind it, the rationale, the completeness of the data behind it. There's certainly cases where it's sort of in a case by case. You can categorize the situations, right? But certainly the most concerning one and a harmful one is when race is conflated with biological differences.
And I want to kind of use this as jumping off into the report itself and the recommendations. And I want to start with you, Helen, kind of, obviously, like we said, it's a long report, it has lots of really important, interesting recommendations for folks to dig into there. But can you kind of give us a taste of what to you are some of the most important ones to pull out for folks?
Oh, absolutely. And we've been kind of hinting at them all through this conversation, which has been great, including what Joseph and Sindy just raised about gatekeepers. In fact, there are recommendations in the report for both journal editors as well as funders to be really careful about how race is included in articles or in research grants that are submitted. Like, they have a real role here to actually help make sure that this doesn't continue to get propagated forward without some critical review. Obviously, a lot of the recommendations, of course, are for our community, my community and Joseph's community, the Specialty Society community, to really continue to do this work, both in terms of educating clinicians, as we talked about early on, both medical students and others, but also educating patients. I think most patients have no idea that race is included in some of these algorithms. They need to understand what the implications are, and understand why we're doing the work that we're doing. Very importantly, and thanks to the Moore Foundation and our work with Doris Duke, there's a really important role we need to pay to really take, in many ways, the work that Joseph is doing and so with the work that some of the other societies have done as well, to kind of come up with a primer, to come up with a playbook that says, a lot of other societies have work to do here. Let's give them sort of a how-to playbook to say, here's how you approach this. Here's how you need to look through all of your guidelines, your guidance documents, and your algorithms to really think about how you can both address the guidelines and the guidelines that need to change, and how you can do it and how you can monitor it. Certainly, I mentioned the funders, the researchers. I think there's a real role, as I mentioned earlier, for making sure that the research and the data sets that feed into our guidelines and our algorithms are diverse enough. If you look at so many of the guidelines around cardiovascular disease, they come out of the Framingham Heart Study. I did some time in Boston during my training. I know what Framingham looks like. It's not very diverse. We've got to make sure that the diversity of those data sets feeds into those guidelines in a way that makes sense. So we need to continue to work on that, work with our AI community, as we mentioned earlier, work with the hospitals, many of whom may have some local guidelines and algorithms that have been built in locally, and understand what they understand their roles are. And frankly, there's a role here for payers, both private payers, public payers. There's as part of the evidence report that was done by ARC, they really couldn't find a lot of transparent algorithms that the payers use, though they use them. And we need to continue to look for and find the transparency and when those are used. So there's some other areas as well where public health and others can play a role. But I think the beauty of this report is that no one community can do this alone. And we really see a role where we can all come together and really make a difference. And I'm super excited by the 7 questions in the Q&A, so I don't want to take too much time.
Yeah. And Ryan, one other point Helen made, I'm glad that she raised the atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease example. One of our other partners in the Doris Duke work is the American Heart Association. And that's fascinating because the data set, the cohort was lacked diversity, there was an attempt to overrepresent populations of color in the equation when they developed it. But what has resulted is and I'm using, these are their words, this is the AHA's words themselves, a biologically implausible difference in the way that the algorithm performs or addresses cardiovascular disease risk factors in Black versus white patients. And so this drives the point home that the path to each one of these is different. And they all require a thorough understanding of their derivation. Again, I've learned this, again, the beauty of Helen bringing the societies together and all of the funders is that we're all learning from one another. And, in many ways, the atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, risk disease algorithm is an example of where you have to have the correct data to begin with. You can't fudge it. And that gets back to Sindy and the importance of authenticity in the science. So I will stop there. I know we've got folks queuing up in the chat. So
and there's some great ones I peeked.
Yes, and I want to get to those in one second. I do want to do one before we get there. I do want to ask you, Joseph, to talk a little bit more about the example with because I think the next step here is those recommendations. I really appreciate that those recommendations are laid out of like who can do what. But then the next step obviously is always like implementation. Like how do you actually do these things? I mean, and you all have already mentioned and alluded to the challenge of implementation, the challenge of actually getting into practice a new algorithm. And I know, Joseph, you talked about the UTI example. And my understanding is you're also, your organization is also looking at all of, a wide breadth of algorithms and calculators to see if there are other ones. Can you just kind of briefly give us a sense of like, what is it like to try to do that work? And because I feel like that could be very daunting for a lot of people listening to this, thinking you're expecting me to like go back through all of these calculators and algorithms we're using. How could you even do that? Can you just talk a little bit about how you're approaching that?
Yes, well, that is the work that Doris Duke and the partners are supporting us to do. The American Academy of Pediatrics has some 400 policies that we have produced. Not all of them are clinical, have clinical algorithms. In fact, a small portion of that have the kinds of clinical algorithms that we're talking about today, where race and ethnicity is evident. If you did a search term on those, it would pop up. But to answer your question, Ryan, it is going to take a thorough, I use this term, a thorough scrubbing for professional societies, a look at all of their clinical product, because in many ways, bias shows up in ways that, in fact, we may not even know. I'll give you an example. So we're going through right now the first 150 with our team, our rapid response team. And so, for instance, when race is used or any race ethnicity groupings are used to describe epidemiology. So said problem has X% prevalence in this group versus that group versus that group. The one that I'll use as an example is the AAP publishes a statement on the risk of drowning prevention, and Black children and Native American children have higher rates of drowning, and so that is stated as part of the obligatory epidemiology at the front of every one of these statements. That is part of the way that these papers are constructed, but it is provided without context, Ryan. No even attempt at what is going on, what's going on behind this. Well, in fact, the updated iteration of that particular policy did include now language that speaks about history. It speaks about bias that is rooted in inequitable access, if not outright discrimination against certain populations. For instance, the fact that the enslaved were not permitted to learn how to swim because of fear of escape. And access to swimming pools has probably been one of the most notoriously inequitable swimming pools, one of the most notoriously inequitable areas of recreational experience in communities. So even just taking the deeper dive to explore, again, this is not ancient history and it's not unknown history, but to include that context as part of the description of said problem is also an important corrective action to take. And it doesn't show up as a algorithm or an equation, but that kind of context is important to represent. So that's the kind of work we're developing a rubric to allow all of our contributors who develop policy to go through not only retrospectively as what we're doing now, but going forward as they develop content for our organization, to have eyes to the unsupported context. You make a statement, we need the context. So this is an example of Ryan, perhaps some of the more insidious examples that live in medical literature that are also part of this work.
I do want to now move to the Q&A. I mean, and it picks up really right on some of this. There was a question about if the recommendations include specialties looking at all of its algorithms and guidelines and updating them, as opposed to just removing race for future ones. I think this is kind of a great question for this moment, because I think you just touched on, I think made it pretty clear that this is about looking back and not just looking forward. But I really want y'all to focus in on the second piece, was, simply removing race from future ones. Because one of the things that I found most interesting in the report, and I think that I would guess that will be most difficult in some of this implementation, is it's not always just as easy as removing race. So I don't know who wants to go for this first, but if you could talk a little bit about, okay, you find race is being used in an algorithm or in a guideline, then what?
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think the experience from some of the societies that have gone before is, I think that sometimes you remove race, and I think what you really want to understand is really this concept of sort of race conscious medicine is really why was race a factor before? So what variation were we seeing there that was related to race that may in fact be something important that we should be looking for? And whether that's social determinants of health, whether that's some other truly biologic construct, since race is not biologic, whether that's ancestry, there's so many other factors that should be considered. And I think, Joseph's example of the UTI, where in fact two incredibly scarily obvious clinical factors weren't considered, opens up an important avenue. Should you actually look for what other important factors should be added in when you remove race, rather than simply removing race?
I would just add that there is certainly an element of you have to look for it. It's not always, in some cases it's very apparent and it's been pointed out what are those algorithms that need to be revisited. But, just from the AAP work, we know that if you look deeper, you'll find more. So I think it is there's a need to dig deeper and there's no clear answer. It's case by case.
Yeah, and certainly the work you've been doing with the American Society of Hematology is a classic example of that, where in fact it's clearly ancestry rather than race.
And I can't, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the differential lived experiences that are race determined. For instance, we started talking about lung health. Well, in fact, the historical practice of redlining, which has been outlawed now for 50, 60 years or more, has resulted in exposures to certain communities based on where they live. And so this is where it's exciting to really work, have multidisciplinary kinds of collaborations with folks who are experts in social science, economics, folks who have studied and can help us understand the contributions. For instance, even though a practice that is no longer legal, how has that resulted in impacts on health status for certain communities? And how does that need to be considered when we start talking about the way we assess lung health?
Right. Or reimagining what kind of data sets are possible now as you think about guidelines around lung health and the ability to bring in environmental
Right.
data sets we've never been able to consider. Right. So that's the beauty of where we're going in terms of the ability to bring in these really newly formed data sets that include social determinants of health, environment, and broader factors, including structural racism and these historical factors, as Joseph mentioned.
To the point of data, we have a question about, is there any danger of rushing to incorporate race and thinking about it not as the biological factor, but as kind of this social factor potentially in areas where the data may not be strong enough to support differentiation of care based on those factors? How do societies appropriately give due consideration to these factors without inadvertently recreating some of the past unsupported inequities? Because as we know, there may be better data, but there are often still not great data on a lot of these issues.
And I just say there quickly that to me, that's an opportunity, right? I think that so far, it's an opportunity to strengthen those data sets. We need to know more, and it's not just a data set that lives within a health disparities research setting, but what we're finding out is that we all need these data sets, right, to better inform how these tools should be done. So yes, I agree with the person asking the question, right, that we want to have the right tools, but I don't think is a reason for inaction either, right? But to continue to move forward and what needs to be in place to do better science.
Earlier, folks mentioned the importance of talking to patients. Helen, I think you hit on this in particular, and how important it is to educate patients about these algorithms. We have a question about how to do that effectively. Is it by working with patient organizations, working with federal regulators, state level? Patients are under as much burden as those working in healthcare, and they're sick and seeking help. What's the best way to actually helpfully provide this information to patients?
I think it's a great question. And Joseph, I know the AP works really closely with a lot of the patient partner groups. I do think a lot of the patient organizations are a great place to start. A lot of the patient community-based organizations doing this locally in your community is often a wonderful place to start as well. But I want to let Joseph weigh in as well, because I do think that, your patient partners are so incredibly integrated into your process that I think it's a great example of what others can emulate.
Yeah, and it's not easy. It requires a commitment to transparency and frankly humility. I mean, we have to be very honest about what that we've been talking this morning, and that much of this is rooted in very uncomfortable history. And I think being honest with patients, and before I took on this role, I was serving in a chief medical officer capacity for a large health system, and when we rolled out these corrective actions with regard to chronic kidney disease staging, and then the other one around vaginal birth after cesarean section, patients were upset. Patients were upset, and I think we have to expect that, one, and two, prepare our workforce to be able to demonstrate empathy, demonstrate compassion, and again, cultural humility and listen to why patients are feeling some kind of way about what they've just learned. And it's a process, and certainly, although not explicitly an aim of our project with the Doris Duke Foundation, we realize, as Helen said, that as we roll out these revised algorithms and clinical practice guidelines, they need to be supported with patient-facing materials, and we're very fortunate that our publication arm of our organization, as Helen said, has always been very proactive with advancing the science in ways that patients and families can understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that stood out to me in reading the report is when you change some of these calculators or algorithms, they're the same patient who has not had any clinical changes could have changes in the recommendation for their care and figure out how to have that conversation and help the patient understand that has got to be a very tricky needle to thread.
Absolutely. And for example,
go ahead,
I'm
Helen.
sorry,
I think we're going to say the same thing, Helen.
You're going to say the same thing, but I mean, for example, at our recent meeting, we had a conversation about how, for example, there's now, because of the change in the EGFR algorithm, there should be patients moving up on the transplant lists, that UNOS and others are responsible for. And so there's also really important patient education and clinician education to advocate for patients, in fact, moving up those lists now that those calculations are changed. Joseph, were we going to say the same thing?
That's right. Yes.
Excellent.
Awesome. All right. I want to try to get to a couple more of these. One, and I think maybe Sindy, you'll be the best to answer this one, is looking at specifically journal editors and reviewers for those journals. What type of additional education and guidance is needed to help them ensure that they're able to do a deeper dive beyond simply reporting race without the additional context?
Absolutely. And I think this is where we need the help of the experts, right? Of researchers. So there are people who have been advocating and asking, to the research community to be more rigorous and mindful of how this is done. And, as a funder, I can tell you, we don't have the guidelines. That is not our expertise. And we need to bring together researchers who know these, right? And who can say, well, what constitutes rigorous consideration of research or not? Or if a journal editor or a funder sees a proposal, how can we spot that this is not rigorous? How can we educate ourselves as well, that about what is best practice or not?
And I'll just add that we can go to groups of journal editors and publishers like we have across CMSS, as well as the International Committee on Journal of Medical Editors, and bring this issue to them and say, can you develop some joint guidance so that we don't have to do this sort of retail one by one? There are ways to bring this report to them, and that's actually one of the recommendations in the report.
Yeah. And so very important, Ryan, because when you do the deep dive into the literature, you look at the references that support some of these wrong practices. They are references that have been kicked down the road for years and continue to be cited as evidence to support wrong practice. And so all the more reason for very rigorous gatekeeping at the level of reviewers and editor and journal editors.
I think I'm going to do one more quick one here. Are there plans to create something like a registry of algorithms with recommendations on, at a minimum, whether race should or should not be included in that algorithm?
We did include that as one of the potential recommendations in the report, that actually having a place to share the algorithms and the recommendations would be really useful. I think we tagged the federal government with that, but we'll see who actually winds up doing it. But I think, again, being able to be very transparent about what's being done, how and why. And also, again, a big part of this at the start was the idea, and I think it was Sindy's word, that the hope was this meeting and this report would kind of build a movement. And I think that's really been our goal. And so anything we could do that continues to push forward, share the experience of people like Joseph and other societies that have kind of gone first to keep pushing this forward and giving people the tools they need to continue to do the work is just incredibly welcome and where we need to go.
There's one other question in here that I don't think we have time to answer, but I just want to call it out because I think it's a super important, interesting one, which is about, can we be optimistic about a future without race-based medicine with the advent and evolution of genomic and individualized medicine? I'm sure
Great
there will
question.
be lots of conversations about that going forward. And so I think that's a really interesting and important question. I'm sorry we're not able to get into it today. The last question I want to ask, though, I guess, is a kind of a takeoff of this, which is, what makes, we've talked about a lot of the challenges for implementing these changes and getting to a better place with these algorithms going forward and the role of race in them. What makes you optimistic that we will get to a place where we have a more race conscious and less race-based clinical algorithm sets out in use in our healthcare system?
For me is seeing the growing engagement of different organizations and people in addressing this, because it's not a small problem, but seeing more being done.
And I'll add, I'm excited about a generation of scholars who are committing their academic wherewithal to this work. This is not one-off work. The folk that we're working with through the Doris Duke Foundation are committed to this, and they're going to represent the group that generates transformation.
Yeah, everything they said, and I'll just add, I think it's the fact that I think we have truly built or are building a community of those committed to do this work across clinical medicine, specialty societies, the technology world, and the research world has to be something powerful to make real change.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank everyone for joining us. I want to thank the panelists. Thank you so much for sharing all of your insights here. I know that the report has been, I believe, posted in the chat, so please do dig into that more. If you are interested in more AI and the role of race, I encourage you to check out our reporting from Tradeoffs. You can find all that at tradeoffs.org/subscribe. And we'll also be having another Tradeoffs moderated conversation on Friday about the role of AI and how both the industry and federal regulators are trying to address trying to address race in AI algorithms. And that is something that you'll be able to watch via live cast put on by the ONC. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks
so much, Ryan.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sindy. Bye.